everyone. The last disorder that we're going to talk about this semester is another one of the cluster B personality disorders, antisocial personality disorder. So in this video lecture, we're just going to go through the symptoms of antisocial personality disorder and how they relate to the criteria for a DSM diagnosis. As we talked about last Friday, the defining overall characteristic of antisocial personality disorder is that it's characterized by a pervasive pattern of disregarding the rights of others or systematically and regularly violating the rights of others. And this has to be manifested by at least 3 symptoms, and we'll talk about what those symptoms specifically can include. In addition, you can only give a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder if an individual is at least 18 years old. So with the other personality disorders, we mentioned that it is rare to give an individual a diagnosis before they are 18 years old because the disorders need to be of such long duration in order to meet criteria. But for antisocial personality disorder, we actually have a strict age cutoff. So you can't give a diagnosis of antisocial PD to someone under the age of 18. But in addition to that, we have another age-related criteria, which is that there needs to be evidence for conduct disorder with onset prior to 15 years of age. So remember that for all of our personality disorders, the symptoms of the personality disorder need to be evident by at least early adulthood. Usually we're looking at adolescence, and need to be sustained over a long period of time. But with antisocial PD, we're actually even more specific than that. So we need to have evidence for severe symptoms of antisocial behavior that are occurring prior to 15 years of age. And these symptoms need to be severe enough that the individual would meet criteria for a conduct disorder. So we haven't talked about conduct disorder this semester, but it's an externalizing disorder of childhood, and it's characterized by repetitive and persistent behaviors that violate the basic rights of others, or that are violating age-appropriate social norms or rules. So the symptoms of conduct disorder include things like aggressive acts against people or animals, destruction of property, deceitfulness or theft, serious rule violations, things like staying out all night overnight without parental permission, so violations of developmentally appropriate social norms or rules, or violating the rights of others, that's occurring before the age of 15 years. So here, when we meet criteria for a diagnosis of conduct disorder, we're showing evidence for a pattern of antisocial behavior, a pattern of violating the rights of others, that's severe and present before the age of 15. So an individual doesn't need to have formally been diagnosed before they were 15 years old, but what does need to happen is that in order to give a diagnosis of antisocial PD, looking back at the individual's behavior, there needs to be evidence that the onset of their antisocial behavior happened before they were 15, and that early antisocial behavior was severe enough that if there had been an opportunity to diagnose them, that they would have met criteria for conduct disorder. So these were the overall criteria for antisocial PD. Let's talk a little bit more about these specific symptoms that can lead someone to meet these criteria. So one set of symptoms of antisocial PD have to do with violations of social or legal norms. So these are ways that people's behavior can either violate social norms or expectations, or be legal violations that would be evidence for antisocial personality disorder. So one of them, this is DSM very diplomatic phrasing, a failure to conform to social norms with respect for lawful behaviors, as indicated by repeatedly performing acts that are ground for arrest. So it's really important to note here that you do not need to be repeatedly arrested in order to meet this criteria, nor is being repeatedly arrested sufficient to meet this criteria. So what this takes into account is that some very successful criminals may never be arrested, and some people who are frequently arrested may not actually be repeatedly engaging in unlawful behaviors. So for evidence that somebody is repeatedly violating legal norms, if that individual is repeatedly breaking the law, even if they don't get caught, even if they don't get arrested, even if they don't go to trial, if you are assessing someone and going to give them a diagnosis, if someone is repeatedly violating legal norms, that would meet this criteria. So somebody who is repeatedly engaging in robbery and violating laws related to theft or robbery or assault or weapons charges, even if that person is very successful in this criminal behavior. If a person is repeatedly engaging in criminal behavior, that would be evidence that they are meeting criteria for this symptom. Another violation of social and legal norms that can meet criteria for antisocial personality disorder is deceitfulness, as indicated by repeated lying, use of aliases, or conning others for personal profit or pleasure. So often this will be manifested as kind of sustained conning, kind of creating alternative identities, manipulating other people with untrue information for personal gain. So someone with antisocial PD may have a habit of lying to other people, presenting information about themselves untruthfully in order to achieve their own goals without considering the possible negative effects on other people. So very successful con men will often meet criteria for antisocial personality disorder. This deceitfulness may be violating legal norms, or it may not. They may be on the right side of the law, but they're violating social norms and expectations regarding presenting oneself truthfully. So that would be another way that somebody could meet a symptom for antisocial PD. Another way that people can violate social and legal norms is consistent irresponsibility, as indicated by repeated failure to sustain consistent work behavior or honor financial obligations. So what this symptom is getting at is individuals who do not meet what society considers to be kind of basic adult responsibilities for being responsible for oneself and meeting one's obligations to society, perhaps to family if you have children or a spouse, that this is done not because a person is incapable of meeting those obligations, but because a person deliberately chooses not to meet those obligations, even if and when they are in a position where they could meet those obligations. So not working, not paying rent, even if they could pay rent, having a child support agreement in place and deliberately choosing not to work in order to get out of paying child support, any kind of situation in which a person is able to meet their obligations ostensibly and chooses not to, even though that choice is a clear violation either of social norms and expectations of obligations, or it may actually be a violation of legal requirements, for example, in the case of legal financial contracts. So these three symptoms are ways that violating social and legal norms can meet criteria. We also have a set of symptoms related to impulsive behaviors. So one characteristic symptom is impulsivity or failure to plan ahead. But this is not just kind of a mild failure to plan ahead, like, oh, we're going on a road trip and I didn't think about what hotel we would stay at, or I didn't think about what I'm going to make for dinner tonight. This is major instances of impulsivity or a failure to plan. So evidence that a person is not able to exhibit foresight and is not able to control their behaviors in ways that may have severe negative consequences for themselves and also for others. So things like a failure to secure housing for your family, a failure to have sufficient food in the house for your children, a failure to consider a safety plan if you're going to be drinking and you are the person who drove a group of people to a restaurant in a car. So all of that would be evidence for impulsivity and a failure to plan ahead in a way that leads to violations or risking the rights of others. Another characteristic symptom is irritability and aggressiveness, as indicated by repeated physical fights or assaults. So in addition to kind of general legal and social norm violations, a very, very common violation of legal and social norms in antisocial PD is physical aggression. So if an individual has a high level of irritability, tends towards a high level of aggressiveness, and is frequently engaging in physical altercations with other individuals, perhaps harming other individuals, perhaps severely, that would be another symptom of antisocial PD. And then the final set of symptoms are very interesting. So these are what we call callous or unemotional traits. So some individuals with antisocial PD, their affective symptoms are towards that anger and irritability. So they have a high level of physical aggression and their characteristic affective experience is characterized by anger. Another set of individuals with antisocial PD, rather than being characterized by a high level of anger, are actually characterized by what we call this cold or callous emotional state. So this low level of baseline affectivity and this low level of affective reactivity. So one way that this can be demonstrated is by reckless disregard for the safety of self or others. So this is considered indicative of callousness. So this is an individual who will go into situations where they may be at risk, they may be putting other people at risk, and not appear to be concerned about that risk. So people who are drag racing on residential streets, people who are engaging in dangerous behaviors where other innocent bystanders might be put at risk, and are not exhibiting concern for their own personal safety or well-being, or for the potential negative consequences for other people around them who might be harmed by their behavior. So that would be a symptom of this callous unemotionalness. And another really characteristic trait is this characteristic lack of remorse. So being indifferent to harming other people or rationalizing it when the individual's behavior hurts another person or when they mistreat someone or steal from another person. So this real sense of callousness and just disregard for the consequences of their behavior and how those behaviors affect other people. So it's both a lack of cognitive remorse, but also an emotional lack of remorse, that you get a sense that their emotional experience when they harm other people, that they don't find that emotionally distressing in the way that most people would find that experience distressing. So to sum up our DSM criteria, we've got this pattern of disregard for violation of the rights of others. So that might be those violations of social or legal norms, might be impulsivity, or it might be those callous or unemotional traits. And we need to see it by at least 18 years of age with evidence that the person would meet criteria for conduct disorder with onset prior to 15 years of age. I want to touch very briefly on a related but not identical concept called psychopathy. So you've probably heard the term psychopath. You may have used the term psychopath. Psychopathy refers to a subset of individuals who meet criteria for antisocial personality disorder. So the term was coined by someone named Cleckley, and he was talking about what he saw as a subset of criminals who shared a set of characteristics that he thought made them particularly dangerous. So maybe the prototypical example of a psychopath, the way that Cleckley defined psychopathy, is Hannibal Lecter from Silence of the Lambs. So some of the characteristics that make Hannibal Lecter a prototypical psychopath, probably the most characteristic feature of what Cleckley called psychopathy is the sense of what he called the mask of sanity. So individuals who are psychopaths are people with antisocial PD who have a sense of superficial charm. He also called them glib. So one way of thinking about psychopathy is that these are people with antisocial personality disorder who also have a very high level of emotional intelligence. So psychopaths are people with antisocial PD who are also very successful. So they manage to appear sane, and they might actually appear more than sane. They might appear very high functioning. They also tend to have a high level of narcissistic traits. They tend towards high levels of grandiosity. With regard to their kind of characteristic emotional state, they tend towards boredom and a need for stimulation. So they tend to be risk-seeking. They might go skydiving. They might go bungee jumping. So they're the kind of people who normal life just isn't very interesting for them. They're always seeking the next thrill. They might really like roller coasters. It's characterized by pathological lying, so persistent deceitfulness and conning. They tend to be cunning and manipulative, so they are lying to other people, they are conning other people, they are cheating other people, but they are doing it effectively. And their emotional state is really characterized by this prominent lack of remorse and these cold and callous traits. So rather than the subset of antisocial PD that's characterized by that intense angry or irritable affective state, individuals with psychopathy are really characterized by that cold, callous emotional nature. So one way of thinking about the relationship between psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder is that all psychopaths have antisocial personality disorder, but not everyone with antisocial personality disorder is a psychopath. So some individuals who meet criteria for antisocial personality disorder, who also have this high level of emotional intelligence, who give the impression of this mask of sanity, who have this grandiose sense of self, who have this cold and callous emotional tenor and look bored, so they tend to seek stimulation. Those characteristics could mean that someone who meets criteria for antisocial personality disorder is part of this subset of the disorder that we would also characterize as being a psychopath. So psychopathy is not a DSM diagnosis, but when we are studying antisocial PD, particularly when we're studying criminal behavior, sometimes we narrow our focus specifically to look at psychopaths because they tend to be some of our most dangerous subset of individuals with antisocial personality disorder. So for example, if you look in incarcerated populations, rates of antisocial PD are higher in incarcerated populations than the general population, but particularly concentrated among the incarcerated population are psychopaths because the severity of their symptoms and the kinds of characteristic behaviors that they're engaging in can lead them to engage in serious criminal behaviors and causing significant harm to others. So we will wrap up there for now, and when we come back in class on Wednesday, we will finish talking about antisocial personality disorder, our last disorder of the semester.